All right. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our YouTube live stream. Today's live stream is going to involve the NBAC task. For those of you unfamiliar, the way the NBAC task works is you are presented with a series of letters, and you are asked to determine whether or not the target for that letter was presented either one letter before for a one back, two letters before for a two back, or three letters for a three back. Today we're actually only going to deal with 0, 1, and 2 backs, basically. So whether or not it was presented now, or one stimulus back, or two stimuli back. For those of you who are familiar with this task and are kind of new for working with ePrime, some of the concepts that we're going to be going over today are nested lists and how they interact with sampling selection. This is actually going to be a pretty list-intensive webinar, mainly because the way that we're doing this is actually going to be a fixed version of an NBAC. So every participant is going to be presented with the same letters in the same order over and over again. The orders are set to sequential, just to ensure that that's the same all the time, that the same letters are being presented with the same number of backs, if you will. We do have a sample of this, and this is actually going to be me generating a punctuated version of the sample just for time constraints. If you go to our experiment library for ePrime 3.0, you're going to see the sample. It's called NBAC Fixed. Also note that we have a couple other versions of the sample as well. We have array versions of the sample, and what the array versions of the sample do is they ensure that the stimuli remain different while the sampling remains the same. So if the fixed version of it isn't necessarily the type of NBAC that you'd like to do for your study, do take a look at that array version of the sample. The structure is going to be very similar. What's going to be different is there's a scripting array, or an array that's done through script at the top of it that handles the randomization for all of that. But for now, we're just going to be demonstrating the simplest version of the NBAC. So the first thing we're going to do, like most other experiments, is we're going to make a welcome screen at the very beginning of the procedure here. Let's go ahead and double-click on your session proc at the top of the Experiment Explorer here. Take a text display object and drag it and drop it as the first object in the experimental timeline. And we're actually just going to rename this. You can either rename by right-clicking and clicking rename, or I like to click F2 on the keyboard. And we are going to rename this one to welcome, just so there's something welcoming participants to the study. Let's go ahead and double-click on it to open it in our workspace. And I am just going to write some very simple welcome text. All right. This task involved viewing single letters presented one at a time. Your job is to determine whether or not the letter currently on the screen is a target or a non-target. Press any key to continue. So now that I have the text of my text display object all set up, the only thing I need to do is go ahead and set up the actual properties. We're going to do that by clicking on the properties page in the upper left-hand corner here, clicking on the duration input tab, and changing the duration from its current value at 1,000 milliseconds, or 1 second, to infinite. I like to give participants more than enough time to read. Now, in order to press any key to continue, all I need to do is click Add under my input masks. I need to add a keyboard device so ePrime knows that it's looking for a response from the keyboard. And I'm going to keep my allowable at any. What this is going to do is allow participants to basically just take an open hand, smash the keyboard, and anything will move on from the screen. I'm going to change my data logging tab as my one last edit from none to time audit only, and I do like to log more data than necessary just in case. Go ahead and click Apply and OK, and that's all I need for this welcome screen. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to make another text display object that's going to tell participants about the mapping in this experiment. So what do I need to press for a target? What do I need to press for a non-target? This information is going to be very important for participants whenever they are setting up their experiment, whenever they're kind of learning the task, and that's the first thing they're going to be doing, so it's important to have this on a separate text display object. So I'll take another text display object and I will drag it and drop it from the toolbox here, put it just after my welcome, and I will change this from text display 1, rename this to mapping. Go ahead and double click on it to open it in the workspace, and I'll just write a few sentences about the key mapping for this experiment. So if the letter on the screen is a target, you should press 1. Letter on the screen is a non-target, you should press 2. And then just press any key to continue. Perfect. So that's all I need for this mapping text display object. Just if the letter on the screen is a target, press 1. If it's a non-target, press 2. That way participants know what the key mapping is, and it's pretty easy for them to recognize. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the properties pages again, and just make the exact same change I made to my welcome screen. Click on that duration input tab, change my duration to infinite, add a keyboard device as an input mask, keep my allowable set to any, and change data logging to time audit only. And click apply and OK. Before I go ahead and click OK, I'm just going to hop over to this logging tab and demonstrate what the time audit properties log. They log the duration error, onset delay, onset time, and onset to onset time. What these 4 properties are going to do is it's going to do a very good job of telling you exactly how long this was on the screen and if there's any timing related issues with it. We don't necessarily need to know what button they pressed to advance from this, since it really doesn't matter. The fact that it advanced means that they pushed a button anyway. So we'll just use this time audit properties just to double check that they actually read it and that there was enough time, this was presented for enough time for participants to actually read. So let's go ahead and click OK to continue. Now after mapping, I need one more text display object, and that's my practice instructions. My practice instructions is just going to be a text display object that lets participants know that we're going to be practicing this first, so there isn't as much pressure on these next set of trials. We do want to add a practice set of trials to this, just so participants know that, hey, we're going to practice this first because we don't want the practice, or the time participants take to practice to show up in the data. So let's go ahead and add one more text display object. And we're going to rename this one from text display 1 to practice instructions. There we go. Double click on it to open it in the workspace, and then just type some very quick practice instructions. Press any key to continue. So now that I have my practice instructions all written out, again, the exact same edits are going to happen. I'm going to click on my my properties tab here, click on the duration input tab, change duration to 1000, change input mask to keyboard, change data logging to time audit only, and keep allowable set to any. All I need to do, very simple, third time we've done it in a row. So I'm going to go ahead and click apply and OK to change that. So now the next thing I need to do is I need to actually make my block list for my practice trials. Prime, as I mentioned in some of my other live streams, likes to structure things in a session, block, and practice kind of structure. This block is going to be my practice block of trials. So it needs a list for the practice block. So I'm going to go ahead and double click on my session proc up here, and I am going to add a list object. And this list is going to be my practice block. So I will type prac block list because the list it is the practice version of my block list. There's going to be later just a regular block list, but that's when we actually get to the critical trials. It's going to happen later. So for my prac block list, I'm going to double click on it to open it in my structure window here. Now the instructions are actually what's going to be varying on this list object, because the instructions are actually going to be different depending on the task that the participants are doing. So they'll be doing either the 0 back, the n back, or 0 back, the 1 back, or the 2 back. And those instructions are going to be drastically different depending on the condition. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to create a procedure here. This procedure is just going to be called prac block proc. Hit enter, and I would like to make the default value for newly created levels. Now I'm going to actually have 3 levels on this list object. I'm going to have one for my 0 back, one for my 1 back, and one for my 2 back. So let's go ahead and click on these here. And I'm going to add an attribute. This attribute is just going to be called instructions. Now this is actually going to hold the entirety of my instructions, and there's going to be something very unique about the way I enter text into here. Now the text I want to appear like this. I want to have each of these different sentences, or I want to have several sentences on a different line like this, and I want the line to be spaced correctly. To do that, instead of actually typing things in and then hitting enter, because if you notice, if you hit enter, it'll actually just move on to the next cell here. It won't actually do that enter. I'm going to have to put a new line break into my instructions here. So I'm going to start typing, and once I get to my first new line break, I'll call that one out. So this one is going to just say 0 back condition. This is going to be essentially the header of this text display object. Now, after this, I want to have 2 line breaks before I actually start my instructions. So to do 2 line breaks, I do backslash and n as 1 line break, and I do backslashes n as my second line break. I'll keep these right next to each other. That way it knows that it's entering 2 line breaks. This won't actually show up as backslash n. Once this actually goes into my text display object, it'll just show up as a character return. I'll just type the rest of my instructions. So the letter Z is a target. All other letters are non-targets. So every time the person presses Z, they're supposed to press 1 because that's the button to press for targets. So then I do 2 character returns here. And then just remind participants of the mapping. Target, 1 equals target. And then I will do 2 more character returns here. 2 equals non-target. We'll capitalize that N in non-target just to make it look better when it actually runs. And then after that, press any key to continue. Now if you notice, we actually have the entire text of the instructions object that I'm about to make held within the single cell of this list object. This is actually what I'm going to do for the other 2 instructions as well. So the structure is going to look very similar. I'm going to have the press 1 for target, 2 for non-target, and key to continue. But what's going to change is whatever's in here and whatever's up front here. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to copy this, and I'm going to delete that question mark, paste it, and just change the important parts. So now instead of 0 back, this is going to be on my 1 back condition. So then my instructions in here aren't just Z are the targets. It is, in this case, a letter is a target. Target if it is the same as the letter that came 1 before it. And then I'm going to have that same mapping, which is 1 equals target and 2 equals non-target. And then the 2 back is actually going to be a lot simpler of an edit because it's going to be very, very similar to the 1 back condition. I'm obviously going to change my 1 to a 2 here. And then it's going to be a letter as a target if it is the same letter that came 2 before it, obviously. And my mapping is exactly the same. So 1 is a target, 2 is a non-target. Now that looked a little complicated, especially because I have those /n's in there and there's actually full text in my instructions. But I'm going to show you how this is going to work, and it's going to look really cool the way we actually implement it into our experiment. So now that I have my instructions in here, the next thing I want to do is I want to actually make my block instructions text display object. So in my practice block proc here, which is where the block is going to start, I'm actually going to take my text display object and drag it to the front of this procedure, and I'm going to rename this one just to block instructions. Notice that I don't actually call this practice block instructions like everything up until this part had. That's actually for a very important reason. You're going to see why a little while later. So now, instead of typing out all of that text again, this is going to vary depending on which block of trials E' is currently running. It's either going to be those 0 back, 1 back, or 2 back. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to change this in block instructions to just an attribute reference to that instructions attribute that I made in my block list that holds all of those. So I'm going to just click on this, and that's all I really need to change there. I need it to just say instructions. So now that I've made this change, what I want to do is I want to actually save my experiment. This is actually starting to grow pretty big, and I don't want to have to repeat any of this. So all I have to do is click File, click Save. I'm actually going to just save this one. This is the same folder as all of my live streams. These are all the past live streams I've done. This one is going to be fixed nback. We do recommend saving pretty frequently when you're using ePrime, just to make sure nothing happens. Let's say somebody walks by and unplugs the computer. We don't want you to lose any of that data, so don't forget to save as often as possible. All right, now that I have my instructions referenced correctly, if you remember from the instructions, each one of them says press any key to continue. So I'm just going to make the exact same edit that I made to all of my welcome, mapping, and practice instructions text display objects. That's going to be change the duration from 1000 to infinite, add a keyboard input mask, keep my allowable as any, and change my data logging to time audit only. Click apply and OK. At this point, we should probably make a song about that because we do it so often. And it'd probably be pretty catchy. All right, so after my block instructions, what I need to do is I need to just make a quick screen that just says get ready, letting participants know that, hey, we are going to get ready. The instructions or the task is going to happen very soon. And it's literally exactly what you think. It's just going to be get ready on a blank screen. So we'll take text display object, change it just after block instructions, and let's rename it from text display 1 just to get ready. Again, I'm not naming this practice get ready or any sort of weird variation of that, and that's for a very important reason that we're going to show pretty soon. So I'm just going to set get ready here, and obviously just type the words get ready, and then press any key to begin. Again, we will change the properties here to a duration of infinite, a keyboard input mask, an allowable set of any, and a data logging of time audit only, not responses only. There we go. And done. That's all we need to change for here. If you notice, the top of my screen here is getting a little cluttered. I actually like to kind of remove these things if I can. I'm pretty much done with my block list. We're now going to move on to the trial portion of this. So I'm actually going to close all of these. And you can close all of these tabs either by clicking on these X's in the right-hand corner, or just by clicking Window and clicking Close All. ePrime closes all of it. It's pretty nice. So now that I have my Get Ready set up, now I need my practice trial list. And my practice trial list is just going to come right after this list object, or this Get Ready object. My practice trial list is what's going to hold all of my independent variables, and this is actually where we're going to be using the nested list technique. I'm going to be demonstrating this in a little bit of a different manner. What I'm going to do actually is I'm actually going to set up the structure of my practice trials, and then I'm going to set up my independent variables afterwards, and you're going to see how that happens. So I'm going to take a list object here. Typically this holds my independent variables, and I'm going to rename it from list1 to just prac trial list. And we'll double click on it to open it in the experiment structure window. Now prac trial list is going to look very, very blank. All I'm going to do is I'm going to have a weight of 20, and I'm going to add a procedure called trial proc. I'm going to hit enter. Note that this isn't prac trial proc or any weird variation of that. This is just because this is going to be used later, and I'm going to show you how I'll use this later, but it's going to make making the second half, or the critical portion of this task, really fast and really efficient. So what I need to do now is I need to actually think about how my stimuli are going to be presented here. I'm going to have a 0 back, a 1 back, and a 2 back. And those need to vary based on which of these blocks ePrime is currently sampling. So I need to make a list that corresponds to the stimuli held in each block, and I need to reference those in my prac trial list. The way I'm going to do that is through a nested list. How I'm going to do this is I'm actually going to have a pool of list objects in my unreferenced eObject section, and ePrime is going to selectively pull up any one of those list objects based on the condition that it's running right now. The first condition, if you look at my practice block list, is going to be called 0 back. So I'm actually going to make a list object that's just going to be called prac 0 list. This is going to be the practice version of my 0 back task. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to close all of my windows here, and I'm actually going to take my list object and just drag it into the workspace. Not into my experiment explorer, the structure there, actually just the workspace, and look what it does. If I drag it into the workspace, it just adds it to the unreferenced eObjects down here and calls it list1. I'm actually going to rename this prac 0 list. Now what this is going to do is this is actually going to be my, this is what's going to contain my independent variables for the experiment. So for prac 0 list, if you look at the practice block list here, it just says Z is the target, all other letters are non-targets. So what I need to do is fill this out accordingly. So all of my letters, I'm just going to fill out some random letters. All of the Z's are going to be targets, and all of the everything else are just going to be non-targets. So let's jump into my prac 0 list here. I am going to make one attribute here, and this is going to be called trial type, just so I can keep track of the type of trial that it's going to be. I'm going to make one more list, and this is going to be called cell number, letter. There we go. My next one is going to be called cell number. And my next one is going to be correct. There we go. So the trial type is actually going to determine whether or not this is a novel stimulus, a distractor stimulus, or if it's just my target stimulus. So all novel stimuli are going to be stimuli that are shown for the very first time. In a zero back, a distractor stimulus is a stimulus that appears for a second time. So you're going to see that I'm going to type a G, and then I'm going to type a G again. The first time the G appears, it's actually going to be a novel stimuli because they've never seen it before. Every recurrence of that G is going to be considered a distractor stimuli, since on the zero back task, you are only responding to Z's as a target, not whether or not a letter has shown up again and again and again. So for my first trial, the trial type is of course going to be novel because I can't repeat anything, and I wouldn't want to show Z as my first trial here. So I'm going to put the letter J. My trial type, like I said, is going to be novel. The letter itself is actually going to be J. The cell number is going to be 5, and my correct response to this is of course going to be 2 because it is a non-target. There we go. Since this is only going to be 20 trials, I'm going to add multiple levels here. I'll add 19 levels, and that's going to represent all of the stimuli that I'm going to present in this version of the list. So I'm actually just going to fill all these in very quickly, just so you don't have to sit there and watch me type all of these in. In this instance, I have to actually type in each row, so this may take a little bit of time. And if you are following along, I do have a cheat sheet in front of me. This cheat sheet is actually just taken directly from the sample task that we have, just so I make sure that I have everything kind of all lined up with that. So these are going to be here. These will all be 2 as well. G is a distractor. Cell number for distractors is a 5, so we're just going to change this based on target and non-target. Novel will be Q. Whoops. There we go. Target, which is Z. 2 1. Oops, all novels will be 5, 2. So my correct responses, my target will of course be a Z, and my 2 novel ones will be T. Okay. And we'll do a distractor. This will be a Q. And it'll be incorrect of a Q. Then we'll do a few more novels. Distractor, target, novel. So capitalize these. Novel, and then we'll do one more target at the end. There we go. So my distractors will be my novels will be B, A, and C. B's already used, so we will do O. My distractors will be B, S. Target is, of course, going to be Z. My distractors and my novels are, of course, all going to be cell number 5. Targets will be 2. And correct responses are going to be 2 and 1, so novel 2, 2, 2, 1, 1, and 1. There we go. So this is going to be a 0 back, and this is set up correctly. So we have our novels, our distractors, and our targets. The cell number for everything but our targets is going to continue to be a 5, and the correct answer for everything but our targets is going to be a 1. So all of my non-targets here are 2s. My correct answer or the targets here are 1s. That's exactly what I need. I'm going to keep this as sequential because I want each participant to be presented with exactly this. So now what I need to do is I actually need to reference these stimuli. I need to reference them in my practice trial list here. Now, since I already have this as a list, I need to nest this. And I have a weight here of 20 since I'm going to be presenting 20 trials, and there are 20 samples here for me to present to participants. But I want the contents of this nested list to change every time E' runs this practice trial list. So I'm going to have a prac 0 list, a prac 1 list, and a prac 2 list. So I need this to change as often as I can. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to make a new column in my prac block list. And this is actually just going to reference an attribute just called list name. There we go. And my list name is what I'm going to use to tie my instructions here to the nested lists or to these unreferenced lists here, and eventually nest them. So each one of my stimuli gets a correctly represented list object. So I called this one prac 0 list. So I'm going to type that in my list name here. I'm eventually going to have a prac 1 list, which I'll make for you, and a prac 2 list, which I will also make for you guys. Now I'm going to take this list name and I'm going to open up prac trial list here, and I'm going to change the nested value from nothing to that list name attribute that I had made. So now my nested list is going to change between prac 0 list, prac 1 list, and prac 2 list. Those other two I'm actually going to be making depending on the block that I'm in. That way, whenever they receive the instructions for a 0 back, they actually get a 0 back task. Same for 1 back and same for 2 back. So I'm actually going to go ahead and now make my prac 1 list. So it's going to be exactly the same as my prac 0 list. I'm going to exit out of all of these, take a list object, drag it into the workspace, and I will rename list 1 just to prac 1 list. And while I'm at it, I'm going to go ahead and make one more, and it's going to be my prac 2 list. Oops. And screen seems like it's gone. Let me just get that back quick. There we go. So I'm just going to name that to prac 2 list. There we go. Alright, so for prac 1 list, let's go ahead and fill out the exact same thing. It's going to be the relative same structure. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm actually going to copy all of these cells here. I just do that by taking this little arrow and highlighting all of my cells there. I click Control-C. Then in my prac 1 list, I make one more new attribute, have that same drop-down arrow, and click Control-V. Now obviously the rules here are going to change. My novel, my distractor, and my target are going to change. So I'm going to actually have to re-edit these, but what I can do is rename these attributes to something very similar. So my trial type is going to be the same attribute. My letter is going to be the same. And then my cell list is going to be the same, or cell number. And so will my correct. There we go. So now this is actually going to change just a little bit because the rules are a little different. So instead of Z being the target, it's going to be if they've seen it one before. So for my prac 1 list, I'm actually going to have a bunch of novel stimuli appear first. It's actually going to be my first 8 trials are going to be novel stimuli. So I'll have novel, and I'll just copy and paste these. I can copy and paste them like that, or if I do the little fill handle, as I've seen shown in past live streams, I can just drag and drop this. The cell number for all of these is of course going to be 5, and the correct answer for all of these is going to be 2, but my letters are going to change, and my letters are actually just going to be, let me see here. Now the next one is going to be my target. It's just going to be a V again. Then after the target, I'm going to have 2 novels. My 2 novels are going to be P and J. I'm going to have another target after that. And that one's a correct answer. Then I'm going to have a distractor. That one's going to be P. My cell number will be 5. And of course, since it's just a distractor, my correct will be 2 there. There we go. So now I have all the way down to that P, so I'll just fill in the remaining letters there. So the distractor P, I'll have a target P, I'll have 2 novels. My 2 novels are going to be H and N. I have a distractor, which is going to be another H, a target, which is a 3rd H, and then a distractor, which is going to be, we'll make that one an N, and then I'll have a novel down here, and that one's going to be a Z. So then I'll make sure that these all line up, so my targets all have a correct answer of 1 and a cell value of 2. And there we go. That is a properly created Prac 1 list. So that's all I needed to do there. If you're following along, please feel free to pause to fill all this stuff in. And then all I need to do is my Prac 2 list. So I'm just going to take the exact same things I copied from Prac 0. I'm just going to copy and paste them into my Prac 2 list. I'm going to make a new attribute reference, and I'm going to paste those in so they all have the correct, or they all have filled out stimuli. My attribute is going to be called a trial type. My next attribute will just be called letter. My next one will be called cell number. And my last one is going to be called correct. There we go. So now all I need to do is just fill out all of these values again. I'm going to do this one more time, and then this is going to be the last that I actually fill in all of these cells. I'm not going to repeat this for the real trials, the critical trials. I'm actually just going to repeat what I have in here. I understand that that's bad experiment design, but that's going to save a lot of time on my end. But just know that you can replace, once I do this and set these list objects up, if you'd like to replace the actual letters that are used as targets inside each of these for the correct or for the practice and critical trials, it's going to function almost identically. I do also recommend making more trials, but we'll get to there. So now all I need is my Prac 2 list. So my first 6 are going to be novel letters, and those novel letters are going to be Q, N, S, V, B, and H. And I have a target that's going to be a B. And if you notice, B is now 2 cells back from that one, which is why it is the target. Then after my target of B, I'm going to have another target of H. It's going to be H because that one's also 2 back. And after my target of H, I'm going to have a few novel ones. I will have a P and X and then a target. A P is novel. I'm going to have, and this one will also be, let me see here. Then I'll have a novel. I will have C, X. I'm just going to fill all these letters in quickly. There we go. And then make sure I have these here correct. Target, target. Then I have novel. Then, let's see, target, novel. Novel, 2 novels there. Then a target. Then novel, distractor. And the rest are just going to be targets. And then my rules are going to be exactly the same here. So all of my novels are going to be 2 for correct. My targets are going to be 1 for correct. distractor, target will be 1, level, and then all of my last ones here will be targets. Need to make sure I change that cell number so they're all correct here. All of my correct answers are going to be, my correct answers will be 2, my incorrect will be 5. And these are all 2s here. Perfect. So that's my 2 backlist. So now that I have both of those already set up, the next thing I need to do is actually make a reference to these practice lists in here. So I have them listed here, and if you look here, my practice list, this is going to be updated every time E prime cycles through one of these blocks. So that's already set up correctly as well. So now I just need to make my methods of presenting these. And those are actually going to be through a fixation object and a stimulus object. I want the fixation just to be on screen so participants' eyes aren't like wandering all over the screen trying to find the stimulus, because I don't want it to add to my reaction time at all. So I'll go into target proc here. The first thing I'll make is just a text display object for stimulus. I'm just going to rename this one, there we go, to stimulus. And all that's going to be on stimulus is just the reference to that letter that I had made here. So I'm going to make an attribute reference for a letter. And I'm going to go in my duration input tab here. I'm going to change duration to, we'll say 3000 milliseconds. I'm going to add an input mask. It's going to be a keyboard. My allowable is going to be either 1 or 2. It's going to look like a 12. It's 1 or 2 because I can only input 1 response. You can find that under advanced and max count right there. And my correct is going to be that correct attribute that I had made on my nested list objects. I'm going to keep, so what I did there is I specified a correct and I didn't actually set data logging. It recommends that you set data logging to standard. I would have loved that as a user in the past, and I'm happy we have it now. So I'm going to keep my data logging set to standard, and pre-release is going to say same as duration. I'm going to click apply and OK to save these changes because that's all I need to do here. So after that appears, all I need is a fixation cross. That is just going to be a little plus sign in the center of the screen. So I will change text display 1 to fixation. And just in the center of the screen there, hit fixation. If this looks a little weird, like it should appear in the top of the screen and not the center of the screen like Ed mentioned, I definitely recommend checking out some of our previous live streams. I do talk about this pretty extensively and why this appears on the top of the screen but actually shows up in the center. So I do recommend taking a look at that. But that's actually all we need now to set up our practice block and practice trials. That's actually going to close out this portion of it, because if you look here, I now have a 0 back, a 1 back, and a 2 back, and now my practice trials are done. So making the critical trials for this is actually going to be pretty easy, because it's just going to involve a lot of copying and pasting and not much making or creation of new content. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to close out of all of these first. So let's go to Window and go to Close All, and I'm going to open up my session proc. So now if you look, I have welcome, mapping, practice instructions, and practice block list. Now I want real instructions. Participants have already finished up with the practice version of the procedure. They've gone through the practice 0 back, 1 back, and 2 back. So let's go ahead and make some instructions for the real version of the experiment. So the critical trials. Going to make a new text display object, take it just after prac block list here, and I'm going to rename it from text display 1 just to real instructions. I'm going to hit enter here. I'm going to double click on it to open it in my workspace here. And real instructions are just going to say, now let's move on to the real trials. This test will take about 10 minutes to complete. If you have any questions, please take this opportunity to ask the experimenter. Press any key to continue. Perfect. So I'm going to make this exact same change that I made to welcome and mapping and practice instructions and block instructions and get ready, the same ones that you're all very familiar with. I'm going to click on the properties page, click on the duration input tab, change duration to infinite, add a keyboard input mask, keep allowable at any, and change data logging to time audit only. We should be able to do this in our sleep by now, right? So once I make all of those changes, that's all I need for my real instructions, and I'm going to make a copy of this. So instead of prac block list, I'm actually just going to make a block list. So let's go ahead and add that to our experiment here. I'll go over to session proc, take a list object, drag and drop, and call this one block list. I'm going to double click on it to open it in my workspace, and block list is going to look almost identical to my prac block list. It's going to hold the list name property or attribute. It's also going to hold my instructions attribute, and oddly enough, these are going to be exactly the same. Participants will be going through a 0 back, a 1 back, or 2 back, and they will be presented them in the exact same order, and they're going to be presented them with the exact same instructions. So this doesn't really need to change. So in my my prac block list here, all I need to do is highlight instructions and list name and hit Control-C to copy its contents. Then I double click on my block list here, add an attribute, and do the same thing I did before, where I just copy and paste. Now you notice when I copy and paste, it doesn't actually resize to how much text there is, like my prac block proc did, or prac block list. That doesn't mean it's truncated, that just means ePrime's kind of hiding it. If you take your cursor and put it in between these two attributes here, you can stretch it out. And if you want it to auto fit, all you have to do is make sure your cursor looks like this and double click on it. And then it will auto fit to the end of the longest sentence on here. In this case, it is my 1 back condition, and it's this little period right there. But it's going to have these exactly the same. All I need to do is change the name of the attributes from attribute 1 to instructions, and attribute 2 is going to be changed to list name. And I'm going to go ahead and save, since I had done a lot of modification to the experiment up until this point. I'm also going to make a procedure here. My procedure in this case is just going to be block proc. Hit enter. It doesn't exist. I would like to create it, and I would like to make the the default value for newly created levels. And I'm actually going to use this little drop down arrow here to select block proc, just so my procedure column is filled in. Now in my block proc, it's going to look painfully similar to these things, or to my practice procedure. So the next thing I'm going to add is my block instructions. That actually doesn't need to change at all, because it's just referencing that instructions attribute that is also in my block list. So all I'm going to do is double click on it. I'm going to highlight block instructions for my practice block proc, drag it and drop it to just after, or just as the very first object in my block proc here. And I can do the same thing with get ready, just drag and drop. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight this prac trial list, and I'm going to copy it by hitting Control-C on the keyboard. I'm going to click in this white space here, and I'm going to paste it by clicking Control-V. It says the object you are pasting change child objects. Do you want to paste all the child objects in addition to the primary object? I'm going to say no. Now what I do here is I say no. It makes a new version of my prac trial list called prac trial list 1, which I'm obviously going to rename. But it keeps fixation and stimulus here already, because these are just the same object referenced in 2 places. This makes my experiment a little more streamlined and a lot more efficient. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Now if you notice, my prac trial list 1 became the first object in my procedure. That's just a quirk of ePrime pasting. If you paste without telling it explicitly where to, it will bump itself to the first item in the procedural timeline. So I'm actually going to take it and just drag it to just after my get ready, because I don't want this to come before get ready. Obviously, I don't want it get ready to show up just before my goodbye slide. It would be really funny, but not entirely great for experiment design. I'm of course going to rename my prac trial 1 or prac trial list 1 object, and this is just going to be trial list. I'm going to hit enter there. Now all I need to do is I need to make different versions of my prac 0, prac 1, and prac 2 list. I'm going to click on my block proc here, because I don't want to reference the same list objects for practice as I do for my critical trials. So I'm actually going to rename the items in this list name attribute from prac 0 list just to 0 list, 1 list, and 2 list. So now whenever my trial list goes to run, it's still going to run 20 items, but it's going to be referencing different lists than my prac trial list did. It's going to be referencing lists called 0 list, 1 list, and 2 list, and if you notice, these things don't actually exist yet, so we're going to need to make them. So I'm going to close all my windows here, and I'm just going to make the list objects first using the same method that I did before, just by taking an object or a list object from the toolbox, dragging it into the workspace, dropping it, and renaming it. And we're going to rename this one to 0 list. Close out of that. I'm going to make my one list and close out of that, and my two list. Instead of editing all of these each individually, I'm going to make them all, and then I'm going to fill them in. There we go. And now I have my 0 list, 1 list, and 2 list. Like I mentioned before, what I'm going to do instead of sitting there and typing out everything, because there is a lot of nuance to typing all of this, as you'd seen when I made my Prac 0, Prac 1, and Prac 2 list, I'm actually just going to copy the contents of Prac 0, Prac 1, and Prac 2 into list 1, list 2, and 0 list. I understand that this isn't proper experiment design. This actually isn't even what's in the sample, but what this is going to do is it's actually going to save us time, and it's going to demonstrate some concepts in ePrime that I'll show and highlight while I'm doing this. So I'm first going to open my Prac 0 list, and I'm going to highlight these 4 columns here. I actually don't need cell number or don't want cell number in my critical list, so I am going to make an attribute reference here. I'm going to paste that, and I'm going to get rid of my cell list there. So now I have trial type, whoops, and I have letter, and then I have my correct, of course. There we go. So now you're going to notice that this is actually exactly the same as my Prac list, and I mentioned that before. What you can do if you want to edit this very quickly is you can change just the letters and change the where the targets show up. So instead of J, S, B, Y, G, H, G, and Q, it can be just a different series of letters. Or if you want, you can take entire trials. So I can take this distractor trial here, and I can put it one higher just by copying and pasting there. And then I'll have to change this one to, this will be like H, and that'll be a novel. And just changing these around as I see fit. Or I can also make the target the first thing in the trial. This actually just makes the structure of everything a lot simpler. It makes editing it a lot easier since these 3 rows are so dependent on each other, the trial type, the letter, and the correct. I can actually find rows that I like, so this distractor row, for example, and I can copy and paste it to wherever I want. Or let's say I want to add more targets. I don't think that, how many do I have? 1, 2, 3, 4. I don't think 4 targets is enough. What I can do in this case is highlight this entire row, hit Control-C, click wherever I have a novel that I don't want, hit Control-V, and it changes that entire row to a target for me. So that's how I would edit these, and you can make the edits on your own however you see fit. I'm actually just going to be making very minimal edits to these just to demonstrate how to get this information from one list object to another. So now that I have my 0 list down, I noticed that I had copied 0 list into my 1 list, so let's actually copy this into the correct place here. So this is my Prac 0 list. Go ahead and open up my 0 list and make that exact same change. There we go. This will be trial type. This is letter. This does not need to be in my critical trials. And this is going to be my correct. There we go. So now that my 0 and Prac 0 list are done, let's go ahead and make my changes to my 1 list. So I have 1 list there, and I have Prac 1 list. Prac 1 list, all I do is copy, using that same method I had shown before, just by taking that little downward arrow and dragging and dropping over here and clicking Control-C. Hop into my 1 list, and actually just change that to meet my needs now. So this is actually going to get moved over, and these will have to be renamed, because that was my, this one will be my correct. There, that was a pretty easy change. So now my targets are correct, they're all 1 back, and like I said, you can feel free to edit these. Since target for the 1 back, the target and novel are going to have to be next to each other. So if I want my target and novel to show up again like that, all I have to do is just take this block, or this block of 2. Oops, I don't want a procedure here. So I just do this, take a target and novel next to each other, copy, and then I will paste them here. But instead of V's this time, I will pick D's. And then this one will, of course, be a distractor. So as you can see, editing these becomes a little more complicated the more numbers of back you get. So 1 back becomes a little more complicated, or a little less complicated. 2 backs get a little more complicated. 3 backs, and so on and so forth. So then after I have made my 1 list, all I need to do is the same principle that I had shown before, but for my 2 list. So I'll take my Prac 2 list, I will highlight my attributes here, go into 2 list, make another attribute reference, Copy and paste, get rid of that third row there because I don't need that one. And I will do trial type. And then letter. And finally correct. There we go. So now I have my 1 list, 2 list, and 0 list all made. They are just kind of offshoots of my practice list. Again, adding more trials to this or adding different stimuli is very easy, and I demonstrated how to make those changes. And if you notice, I now have all of my block proc set up. So the only thing that leaves us with really is just making our goodbye. So to do that, go into session proc here, take a text display object, drag it and drop it to the very end of the procedure here. It's actually going to show up at the very bottom. I am going to rename this from text display 1 to goodbye. And we will just thank them for participating. Much for your participation. Please let researcher know you are finished. And what I'm going to do here is change my duration input tab. My duration will be set to infinite. I'm going to add a keyboard input mask, and my allowable in this case is actually just going to be the space bar. And I'll change data logging to time audit only. And there you have it. This is our fixed and back sample, barring a few little modifications that we had made for the sake of timing and for the webinar. But this is the NBAC sample that you can find on our product service and support site. If you have any questions about this or would like to find the finished version of this sample as well, just to compare what you might be working on right now and what might be finished on our live site, feel free to go to support.pstnet.com. That's our product service and support site. If you log in by clicking sign in the upper right hand corner, that'll let you log into our support site to find all of our samples like this and to ask us questions. If you want to ask me anything about anything that I had done today, like, hey, why did we copy and paste these things? Or do you think that the block list method is better than just hard coding these things and having it select? Any of those questions at all, feel free to send me a support ticket. You can address it either to myself or any of the technical consultants here. But yeah, thank you very much for watching. Please feel free to like and subscribe to our channel. We definitely appreciate that. And have a great day. Thank you guys very much. I hope you guys enjoyed it as much as I did.